And I know you're as anxious as I am to get into close action. But we must bring him right up beside us before we spring this trap. That will test our nerve. And discipline will count just as much as courage.
The Age of Fighting Sail.
Part 14. Trafalgar, a fighting sail finale.
Aboard the Fougueux at 12:10 p.m., Captain Louis Baudouin, watching the Royal Sovereign bear down on him, gave the order to fire the first guns of the Battle of Trafalgar. The Fougueux's master-at-arms later observed that, according to our bad habit in the French Navy, we fired away over 100 rounds from our big guns at long range before the English ship had even practically snapped a gunlock. The Royal Sovereign had benefited from a recent improvement in shipbuilding, the copper bottom. In the late 18th century, it had been found that a layer of copper plates on a ship's hull retarded marine growth and greatly improved speed. The Royal Sovereign was one of the first ships to have been fitted with these plates, and she left the rest of her squadron a quarter of the mile astern. Also, as she swept down on the erratically firing Fougueux, Collingwood ordered everyone to flatten himself on the deck for safety, and to hold any return fire until so commanded. Watching from the Victory's poop, Nelson said, "See how that noble fellow Collingwood takes his ship into action." So swift was the movement of the Royal Sovereign that she was under attack for only 10 minutes before Collingwood discovered the opening he was looking for, between the Fougueux and the Spanish three-decker Santa Ana. He sent the Royal Sovereign slicing between the two ships and delivering his first devastating broadside into the 112-gun Spaniard. Aboard the frigate Euryalus, Midshipman Robinson watched Collingwood open the battle with the magnificent Santa Ana, cut the tacks and sheets and halyards of his studding sails, and, as he reached her, let them drop in the water, grieving, I have no doubt, at the loss of so much beautiful canvas, and discharged his double-shotted broadside into her stern. The Royal Sovereign's first broadside demolished the Santa Ana's ornate stern and put 400 men, who made up almost one half of her crew, out of action. So well drilled were Collingwood's gun crews that within 1 minute they had also fired into the Fougueux. The Fougueux's master-at-arms reported that the Royal Sovereign gave us a broadside from 55 guns and carronades hurtling forth a stream of cannonballs, big and small, and musket shot. I thought the Fougueux was shattered to pieces, pulverized. Fire broke out, and we tried our best, in spite of all the hail shot, to put the fire out. Somehow or other, the gun crews on the Fougueux managed to recover from the shock and started firing back at the Royal Sovereign. A well-maintained fire, the Fougueux's master-at-arms commented, showed the Englishmen that we too had guns and knew how to use them. The Santa Ana also responded in kind. Realizing that his attacker would bear up on his leeward side after breaking the line, Vice Admiral Don Ignatius de Alava concentrated his gun crews on that side. As the two ships came together, the Santa Ana's broadside made the Royal Sovereign heel out of the water. From then on, it was gun crew versus gun crew at a range of scarcely 400 yards, and before long the superior speed and stamina of the Britons started to pay off. Collingwood watched the action, seemingly unfazed from his poop deck. Midshipman Robinson noted, "I could see before me dear old Cuddy, as we called Collingwood, walking the break of the poop, with his little triangular gold-laced cocked hat, tights, silk stockings, and buckles, musing over the progress of the fight and munching on an apple." Noticing that one of his studding sails trailing in the water could still be saved, Collingwood called to his lieutenant, "Come and help me take that in. We shall want it again some other day." Together, as the bullets and cannonballs flew all around them, the two men hauled in the sail, folded it, and stowed it away. On the Victory's poop, Nelson turned his attention from Collingwood to his own approach. At his request, everyone was studying the enemy line to identify the flagship of the combined fleet. As they watched, there was a puff of smoke and a flash of fire from one of the ships, followed by the thunder of a gun. A cannonball splashed into the water ahead of the Victory. A few minutes went before the enemy fired again. A cannonball fell alongside the Victory. Then another fell beyond. The enemy now had the range. At this point, Hardy belatedly brought up the question of the decorations that were sewed over Nelson's chest. Preoccupied with the enemy's fire, Nelson told Hardy that it was too late to be shifting a coat. For 40 minutes, while the Victory made her approach and held her fire in order to conserve ammunition, the flagship was bombarded by the enemy. A cannonball cut a hole in the main topgallant sail, others cut more holes, and the Victory's pace was slowed. The combined fleet's fire was erratic, as Nelson had guessed it would be, and the seas rolling under the vessels made the fire even more inaccurate. However, a lucky shot knocked down the Victory's mizzen topmast, and other balls shredded her studding sails. While the Victory slowly narrowed the gap, another cannonball crashed into her wheel. 40 men were sent below decks to steer the ship by her tiller, answering commands shouted down from the quarterdeck. Mr. Scott was talking to Captain Hardy when a cannonball smashed into him. Marines tossed the mangled body overboard. Nelson turned and asked, "Is that poor Scott who has gone?" But he knew there was no time now for a burial at sea, nor time to mourn a devoted aide. A round of grapeshot mowed down a contingent of Marines. Nelson ordered the rest to take cover, but kept walking the deck himself. A cannonball ripped through 4 folded hammocks in the netting and shattered a part of the quarterdeck, sending up a shower of splinters. One of them tore the buckle off Hardy's shoe. Nelson smiled and said, "This is too warm work, Hardy, to last long." Her sails were full of holes. Her hull was rolling with the swells. But the Victory came straight on, aiming at the center of the enemy line. At this point, Nelson could see the signals indicating the flagship Bucentaure. But he did not make for her yet. First, he had another tactic in mind. Ranging along the ragged enemy line, the Victory slowly moved toward the lead ships. It was almost as if Nelson intended an old-style line-ahead engagement. Only after a few minutes did he order the Victory to turn and go for the center of the line. This, more than any part of his plan, was the Nelson touch. As if he already knew that Villanueva expected him to concentrate on the center of the combined fleet, Nelson made this elaborate feint toward the van before turning as planned and cutting off the enemy's center. Watching the maneuver from the Orion, Captain Edward Codrington said, "How beautifully the Admiral is carrying his design into effect." The Victory plunged between the Bucentaure and the ship astern of her, Captain Lucas's Redoubtable. Only then did Nelson give the order to fire. The Victory's carronades and double-shotted guns all boomed at the same time. One carronade, which was filled with one 68-pound ball and a keg of 500 musket balls, fired directly through a stern window of the Bucentaure and caused terrible havoc. The smoke, dust, and debris set the Victory's own gun crews coughing, and a cloud of dust showered down over Nelson and Hardy. As soon as the Victory was past the Bucentaure, Hardy ordered the helm to port. The Victory turned for another broadside, and in the process fouled her studding sail iron on the foretopsail of the Redoubtable. Nelson's feint toward the head of the enemy line may have been the most important tactic in the battle. Admiral Villanueva was not so stupid as his Spanish colleague Churruca had assumed. Villanueva had planned to order his van to return and surround the British attackers, just as Churruca had proposed. But once again, Villanueva delayed. This time he could have been correct. If Nelson planned to take the van as well as the center, the British might be able to destroy the French-Spanish leading ships while they were clumsily trying to come about in the near calm. That is precisely what Nelson made Villanueva think he was going to do. By the time he did turn and go through the line, firing as he went, Villanueva's signal was too late. Commander of the combined fleet's van was Rear Admiral Dumanoir Le Pelly of the Formidable. Dumanoir kept his 7 ships sailing straight ahead at first because it looked as if Nelson would engage them. But when Villanueva frantically signaled for Dumanoir to return, the latter did not respond for more than an hour, which proved to be a fatal period. Dumanoir later claimed that he could not distinguish the signal in the smoke of battle. He certainly could see that the center and rear of the combined fleet were being attacked by the entire British fleet. However, orders were orders, and Dumanoir said that he did not have any way of knowing whether or not Villanueva intended to keep his van in reserve. Dumanoir only knew that his last orders had been to continue sailing straight ahead. Villanueva, meanwhile, was busy enough clearing away the wreckage from the Victory's first broadside. Guns had been knocked askew, shattered timbers masked some of the gun ports, yet now the Bucentaure was receiving some welcome help. The Redoubtable, next astern, was a 74, which was the smallest French ship of the line, and her captain, Jean-Jacques Lucas, was at 4 feet 9 inches the smallest captain in the combined fleet. He was also known to be one of the most courageous. When the Victory came crashing through the line, Lucas immediately engaged the great 104-gun British flagship. Lucas's seamen tried to throw their grappling irons over the Victory's rail, but it rose too high above that of the Redoubtable. For the sharpshooters in the Frenchmen's tops, however, the difference in size was an advantage. It shortened the range between the Redoutable's mizzen platform and the Victory's upper decks to only 50 feet. The view from the Redoutable's platform was obscured by crisscross rigging and splintering yardarms. Smoke drifted in clouds, alternately hiding and revealing the decks below. Both ships rolled under the swells and rocked with recoil of their broadsides. In the thunder of the guns, nothing else could be heard, and often through the fog of smoke nothing could be seen but the flashes, large and small, of the big guns and the Marines' muskets. It was now that the Redoutable's marksmen repaid Captain Lucas for his days of drill, covering the Victory's deck with a rain of fire that drove nearly everyone to shelter. Only a few figures were left on the quarterdeck. One pair visible to the French sharpshooters was remarkable, a tall, hulking man beside a small, wiry one. They were pacing the larboard rail, and as they turned it could be seen that the small man had one sleeve pinned to his chest. Every French sailor knew who the little one-armed man was, and his chest was covered with medals, which made an excellent target. In the candlelight of the Victory's cockpit on the orlop deck, the litters were stacked in rows as the wounded men groaned and cursed while they awaited the surgeon. Dr. Beatty had just finished examining one of his closest friends and found that he was dead. There was a commotion near the entrance to the cockpit as two seamen stumbled down the ladder carrying a slight body. Even though there was a kerchief over his chest to conceal the medals, everybody realized who it was. "Mr. Beatty," one of the wounded men called. "Lord Nelson is here. Mr. Beatty, the Admiral, is wounded." Beatty and the purser, Mr. Burke, took Nelson from the seamen and carried him to one of the midshipmen's berths, tripping and almost dropping him on the way. Nelson was not able to see in the dark room and asked who was holding him. After being told, Nelson said, Mr. Beatty, you can do nothing for me. I have but a short time to live. My back is shot through." Beatty called for Dr. Scott, Nelson's surviving secretary, who had been giving lemonade to the wounded. Scott came over, looked at the bloody jacket, and, recalling his discussion about Nelson's medals, said, "Alas, Beatty, how prophetic you were." They gently undressed Nelson. In the moving circle of light from the swinging lantern overhead, Beatty tried to probe for the bullet, but it had gone too deep. There was no exit wound in the back, so the bullet evidently had lodged in Nelson's spine. Beatty asked him what his sensations were. Nelson replied that he felt a gush of blood every time he took a breath, and a severe pain in his backbone. He could not feel anything at all in the lower part of his body. "I felt it break my back," he said. Captain Hardy came clumping down, bowed over in the low-beamed orlop deck. Beatty whispered that Nelson's wound was almost certainly fatal. Hardy hurried back to the quarterdeck, where he was now in command. Collingwood would succeed Nelson, but so long as the Admiral was alive, the captain of his flagship spoke for him. Hardy had plenty to do. So intent was his concentration that only later did he realize that he had left teeth marks on the pencil case he held in his mouth while writing orders for his signal officers. He had scarcely returned to the quarterdeck when he heard above the uproar a bugle sound on the Redoutable, followed by the French boarding cry, "À l'abordage." The deck of the French ship was too far below the Victory for the boarders to climb over the Victory's rail. However, the Redoutable's main yardarm had swung down across the rail and could be used as a bridge, and pistol and saber-wielding Frenchmen swarmed onto it. The Victory's Marines concentrated their fire on the yardarm and managed to drive the boarders back. The two ships rubbed sides so closely that the Victory's guns could not be thrust through their ports. Lucas had ordered the ports on the Redoutable closed to prevent the Victory's men from boarding. A member of each Victory gun crew stood by with a fire bucket and hurled water through the port after the guns were fired in order to douse the flames aboard the Redoutable that were caused by the powder blasts before they could spread to the Victory. From the middle deck, Marine Lieutenant Rotley of the Victory recalled, "There was fire from above, fire from below, besides the fire from the deck I was upon. The guns recoiling with violence, reports louder than thunder, the decks heaving and the sides straining. I fancied myself in the infernal regions, where every man appeared a devil. Lips might move, but orders and hearing were out of the question. Everything was done by signs." Indeed, for a few euphoric moments, the Redoutable's Captain Lucas thought that the flagship of the British fleet might be taken by his small arms fire, which would be a historic triumph if it could be accomplished. More than 200 grenades were thrown onto the Victory. With the utmost of success, her decks were strewn with dead and wounded. Notwithstanding the slaughter at the Redoutable's yardarm bridge, Lucas's sharpshooters and grenade throwers seemed to be clearing the way for a boarding party when another British man-of-war came to the rescue of the Victory. While everyone aboard the Redoutable was concentrating on the Victory, The British three-decker Temeraire ranged up on the unprotected side of the Redoutable and let go with all 3 rows of her guns. 74 guns in one catastrophic storm of shot. Captain Lucas recalled, "It is impossible to describe the carnage produced by the murderous broadside of this ship. More than 200 of our brave men were killed or wounded by it." And as the Temeraire came to the Victory's aid, the French ship Foucault, battered by the Royal Sovereign at the battle's beginning but still fighting, came down on the Temeraire. Now 4 ships were locked side by side, the Victory, Redoutable, Temeraire, and Foucault, each firing on one another, while the Victory continued firing on the Bucentaure and Santasima Trinidad on her larboard side. On the Victory's nearly deserted quarterdeck, 19-year-old midshipman John Pollard attempted to avenge his fallen admiral by spraying the tops of the Redoutable with musket fire. Holding his fire until a Frenchman poked his head up from a canvas strip on the mizzen platform, Pollard rapidly picked off 3 of the 4 men he could see. Unnerved by Pollard's accurate fire, the last French sharpshooter waited for him to begin reloading and then made a dash down the rigging. Pollard got the Frenchman as he reached the lower shrouds and sent him crashing onto the Redoutable's deck. Pollard had gotten revenge for the mortally wounded Nelson by killing the man who had shot him, but he would never know exactly which man it had been. The 2 central battles had formed just as Nelson had planned. Within an hour and a half after the Victory had gone through the line, the Battle of the Center was all but won. To the south, the rear ships of the combined fleet were still fighting, but the outcome was only a matter of time. Within an hour, Collingwood's squadron would capture or destroy 12 of the 16 ships he had attacked with his 15 British men of war. Meanwhile, Admiral Dumanoir in the Formidable was still proceeding north, away from the battle, with his 7 ships of the van. At last, Dumanoir decided to enter the battle, either because he had finally made out Villanueva's signal, it had now been repeated by other ships, or because he realized that the alternative was court-martial and probable death. But Dumanoir was too late. It was nearly 2 hours after the battle had commenced, and his attempt to rejoin his fleet became a comedy of errors. 2 of his ships, the Mont Blanc and the Intrépide, collided, which caused the Mont Blanc's foresail to split and the Intrépide's jib boom to rip right off. 2 Spanish ships drifted off into the east. It took Dumanoir more than another hour to move his 5 remaining ships back to the battle area. By that time, the British had won the battle, and the British men of war were more than ready to take on what was left of the French van. When he saw this, Dumanoir bore off to the west. As the French ships glided past, the Victory fired a parting broadside at them. Listening to the concussion of his ship's guns, Nelson cried out, "Oh, Victory, Victory, how you distract my poor brain." Dr. Scott was massaging his chest. Burke tried to get him to drink some of the lemonade. At 4 p.m., Hardy stooped over him. They had won a great victory, he reported. He could count 14 or 15 surrendered enemy ships. Nelson replied weakly, "That is well, but I bargained for 20. Shortly afterward he said, "Don't throw me overboard." "Oh, no, certainly not," Hardy answered. "Then you know what to do, and take care of poor Lady Hamilton," Nelson mumbled. Hardy knelt and kissed Nelson's cheek. Nelson whispered, "Now I am satisfied. Thank God I have done my duty." Hardy knelt and kissed his commander's forehead. "Who is that?" "It is Hardy." "God bless you, Hardy." At that point, Hardy withdrew. Nelson's breathing became labored, and his voice grew faint. Scott heard him murmur, "Doctor, I have not been a great sinner." He mentioned Lady Hamilton and his daughter Horatia, instructing Scott, "And never forget Horatia." Scott heard him whisper once more, "Thank God I have done my duty." His breathing ceased. Nelson was dead. Other British quarterdecks were stained with the blood of British captains. At nearly the same moment that Nelson was hit, Captain John Cook of the Bellerophon, who had called this first battle under Nelson the dearest wish of his life, was struck by a cannonball. He had just killed a French officer on the Eagle's quarterdeck and was reloading his pistol when he was hit. His lieutenant went to take him below to the surgeon, but Cook died before he could be treated. When the Mars came between the French ships Foucault and Pluton, their combined broadside destroyed most of the British vessel's rigging and decapitated Captain George Duff. His lieutenants covered the body with the Union Jack until the battle was over. Aboard the Royal Sovereign, Collingwood had a couple of bad moments. As he stood on his quarterdeck, a splinter had gashed his leg. If he had been wearing boots, they would have protected him. What he thought to be a thump in the back turned out to be an air blast from a near-miss cannonball. His worst moment, in fact, came when an officer from the Victory arrived to report that Nelson had been wounded. Collingwood remembered later that he asked the officer if the wound was dangerous. The man hesitated, said he hoped it was not, but Collingwood could see the fate of his friend in his eyes. Captain Hargood, on the quarterdeck of the Belle Isle, her masts shattered and fallen sails covering some of the gun ports, was struck by a huge splinter. It knocked Hargood down, bruising his side from neck to hip. But he remained calm. He ordered oars to be used through the lower gun ports to maneuver the ship, and the Belle Isle's colors were flown from a pike nailed to the stump of the mainmast. Hargood, back on his feet, joined John Owen, captain of the Marines, in watching the progress of the battle as they shared a bunch of grapes. Inspired by their commander's example, many British officers and sailors were impelled to take brave, if not foolhardy, action. One sailor, named Fitzgerald, from the Tonnant, climbed aboard the Algeciras, scrambled up the rigging to the topmast, cut away the French flag, wrapped it around his waist, and made it back to the lower shrouds before a musket shot dropped him into the sea between the ships. Christopher Beatty, a yeoman of signals and one of the 8 men on the Bellerophon's quarterdeck, not killed or wounded, watched his ship's ensign shot away for the 3rd time, grabbed a Union Jack, ran up the rigging and tied it to the shrouds. In apparent admiration, the enemy sharpshooters held fire until Beatty jumped back on deck. That same spirit seemed to infect the wounded as well. A sailor aboard the Conqueror, his leg completely shattered, lay on deck calmly playing marbles with stray grape shot while waiting to be carried below. The sockets for the ship's capstan bars had been filled with crude first aid kits. Many of the walking wounded found their way to the capstans, bound their wounds, stuck the rest of the bandage back into the socket, and returned to their battle stations. An amputee aboard the Tonnant cheered so lustily at the news of another French surrender that he broke his ligatures and bled to death. The British sailors showed scarcely more bravery than did the French and Spanish. However, convinced of ultimate defeat, many men and officers of the combined fleet fought with defiant determination. Commodore Churuca of the San Juan Nepomuceno found himself under fire from 6 British ships. Churuca went below to direct the fire of his guns, succeeding in dismasting one of his attackers, and was returning to the deck when a cannonball nearly severed his right leg. Rising on his elbow, he called above the noise, "It is nothing. Go on firing." As it became apparent that he would bleed to death, Churuca agreed to be taken below, but he ordered his ensign nailed to the mast. Churuca called for his nephew to say goodbye. Within minutes, he was dead. As the news spread, the heart went out of his men. A third of the San Juan's crew had been killed or wounded. All the masts had gone, and the rudder was smashed. The San Juan's flag was pulled down. Captain Louis-Antoine Cyprien Fernet deserved the name of his ship, the Intrépide. He was nearly the only captain from the van to get into the battle, and saw almost half his crew killed or wounded. Although all of the Intrépide's masts were shot away and there was 8 feet of water in the hold, Fernet stubbornly fought on, slashing the air about him with his curved saber, and shouting that he would decapitate anyone who called for surrender. While the shot and shell sang around them, the Intrépide's colonel of infantry kept ducking behind Fernet until the captain laughed and yelled at him, "Ah, Colonel, do you think I am sheathed in metal then?" At last the Intrépide was battered to a formless hulk. Fernet's officers had to sneak up under the swinging saber and hold their captain down while the colors were lowered. The fiercest fighter of the combined fleet was little Jean-Jacques Lucas of the Redoutable. Lucas fought on despite the crossfire of the Victory and the Temeraire, both of whose guns, aiming low to avoid hitting each other, were shooting holes through the Redoutable's hull below the waterline. By mid-afternoon, the Redoutable had lost her mainmast and mizzenmast and was straddled by the wreckage of the Temeraire's topyards. Where the Redoutable's poop had been was a gaping hole under her helm. Rudder and stern post were smashed and her stern was afire. Most of her guns had also been destroyed. 5/6 of her crew was out of action, and so riddled were the sides of the ship that the wounded who were lying on the orlop deck were exposed to enemy fire. The Redoutable's pumps were crippled, and the water was fast gaining in the hold. Captain Lucas seemed to be the Redoutable's only survivor, as he finally was forced to strike her colors. A floating wreck, the Redoutable was taken in tow by the Swiftsure. The cruelest fate was reserved for Admiral Villanueva of the Bucentaure. The Victory's opening broadside had reduced the French flagship's interior to wreckage. Through the hole in the line that the Victory had opened astern of the Bucentaure had come 4 ships of the Victory's line, the Temeraire, Neptune, Leviathan, and Conqueror, raking the Bucentaure one by one. In the maelstrom that followed, the Bucentaure's guns were put out of action, and her decks were heaped with dead and dying gunners. On her gun decks, one raking broadside sent cannonballs bouncing along the beams, beheading many of the men. Later, broadsides ripping open the gun ports smashed the bodies to a pulp. Loose guns crashed back and forth in the rolling sea, churning through the human wreckage. In the Bucentaure's cockpit, the surgeon and his mates were overwhelmed by 450 wounded, more than half her crew. On the quarterdeck, nearly every officer and man around Villanueva was hit, until he was virtually alone. Villanueva had planned for such a catastrophe. His barge had been ready to take him to another ship. He said to an officer, "The Bucentaure has played her part. Mine is not yet over." He called for his barge, but it had been shot full of holes and smashed by falling spars. Villanueva then signaled the nearby Santissima Trinidad to send a boat for him. There was no answer. He resigned himself to his fate, disconsolately walking the bloody deck and complaining to his flag captain that, amid the slaughter all around, there seemed to be not a single bullet for him. Finally, with his ship a total wreck, isolated in the midst of the enemy and unable to move, he had to yield to his destiny. He looked away as the Bucentaure's captain lowered her colors. Sir Israel Pellew, captain of the Conqueror, saw the Bucentaure's flag go down and sent over James Atchley, who was captain of his marines, to accept the surrender of the flagship. At the sight of Captain Atchley's red coat rising over the Bucentaure's rail, 4 French officers stepped forward to present their swords. One of them was Villanueva, blackened by smoke, but still smartly attired in a long, high-collared uniform coat, green corduroy pantaloons, and sharp-toed half-boots. At first, the admiral thought the captain who had defeated him was the famous Sir Edward Pellew, who, as commander of a frigate, had once destroyed a 74-gun French ship of the line. Atchley set him straight. "That was his brother, sir." "His brother?" cried Villanueva. "What? There are 2 of them?" Another surrender ceremony turned out to be a bit premature. The giant Santissima Trinidad, with her 4 decks of 130 guns, was a formidable fighter but an easy target, and half a dozen British ships ganged up on her. When her colors were shot away and her guns fallen silent, Captain Henry Digby of the Africa sent over an officer to accept her surrender. The British officer found that Rear Admiral Don Hidalgo Cisneros had been wounded, along with his top 2 officers. But another Spanish officer politely informed the British emissary that the Santissima Trinidad had not yet given up the fight. The British officer was courteously escorted back to his boat, and the Santissima's gunners withheld their fire until he was safely back aboard the Africa. The Santissima Trinidad resumed fighting. When the Spanish finally did give up, the scene aboard the big warship was described by one member of her crew as simply infernal. She could not move. The English had torn their sails to tatters. It was as if huge, invisible talons had been dragging at them. Fragments of spars, splinters of wood, thick hempen cables cut up as corn is cut by the sickle, fallen blocks, shreds of canvas, bits of iron, and hundreds of other things that had been wrenched away by the enemy's fire were piling up on the deck. Blood ran in streams about the deck, and in spite of the sand, the rolling ship carried it here and there until it made strange patterns on the planks. The battle was all but over. Aboard the Spanish flagship, the Príncipe de Asturias, Admiral Gravina had watched the Bucentaure and the mighty Santissima Trinidad strike their colors. The Príncipe's mainmast and mizzenmast were riddled and threatening to topple over. Gravina's left arm had been shattered. Realizing that his only hope for survival was likely escape, Gravina signaled to the frigate Thames to take him in tow, and he instructed the other ships that could still follow him to make a run for Cadiz harbor. With 11 ragged ships of the line trailing in his wake, Gravina headed for the Spanish coast. Astern of the fleeing Spaniards, the French ship of the line Achille provided a spectacular climax to the battle. By mid-afternoon, 400 members of the Achilles' crew, including all of her senior officers, had been killed or wounded, but a junior lieutenant, Ensign Vasil Cochard, kept her remaining gun crews firing. Then an arms chest in the foretop exploded, and the sails went up in flames, igniting other sail and spars. The Achilles' crewmen tried to chop down the foremast and dump the blazing mast over the side, but the British ship Prince fired at the mast and cut it in two. The flaming top hamper crashed onto the deck of the Achilles, and fire raced through the ship. Her sailors all dived over the side. The British attackers ceased firing and sent their boats to rescue the swimmers. By late afternoon, they had saved more than 200, and then the Achilles blew up. An officer aboard the ship the Defense described the sight as the most awful and grand that can be conceived. The explosion hurled a column of fire and smoke into the air, resembling for a few seconds a prodigious tree in flames, speckled with many dark spots, which the pieces of timber and bodies of men occasioned while they were suspended in the clouds. Among the Achilles survivors rescued by the British were a pig, which the victors feasted on the next supper, and a naked young woman who was taken aboard the Revenge and given clothing by the sailors. She identified herself as Jeanette, and explained to them that she had followed her husband to sea and had been handing up cartridges to the powder monkeys when the spreading fire had finally driven her into the water. She had not been the only woman aboard the Achilles. Another was saved by the Britannia's crew. Perhaps the most remarkable survivor of the battle was a dog aboard the Conqueror. While clearing for action, the Conqueror's crew had, accidentally or intentionally, thrown a dog out of a gunport. It landed on a ridge under the shrouds and clung there throughout the battle, while cannonballs riddled the hull and musket fire peppered the shrouds. After the battle, the dog was hauled back through the gunport unscathed, but in an understandable state of shock. They were among the fortunate survivors. Collingwood assessed the British loss at 1,609, either killed or wounded. The Spanish loss was 1,022 dead and 1,383 wounded. The French made no official count, but the best estimate was that more than 3,000 Frenchmen had died, and more than 1,100 were wounded. The total number captured, both Spanish and French, amounted to about 8,000. The aftermath of Trafalgar proved even crueler than the battle itself. Among Nelson's last instructions as his life ebbed away was to have his ships anchor. Evidently, despite Nelson's pain, or perhaps before he had been shot, his dependable barometer, his fin, the stump of his right arm, had warned him that a storm was approaching. Also, the oily swells that rolled under the battling fleets indicated that a hurricane was brewing out in the Atlantic. The victors and the vanquished had only a few hours left in which to repair the worst damage to their ships and dress their wounds before the storm struck. Collingwood, now in command of the British fleet, did not anchor, nor is it a certainty that all the anchors in the Royal Navy could have saved the fleet in the storm that swept down on the survivors on the night of October 21st, 1805. It lasted for the better part of a week, and in that desperate time there were no victors and no vanquished, simply men struggling to survive. Damaged rigging crashed over the side. Mastless, riddled hulks were driven toward the rocky Spanish coast. The few ships that were still able to bend a sail tried to take the others in tow. English sailors who had eagerly anticipated the prize money that they had so dearly won had to watch their captured prizes wallow away downwind to destruction. But it was worse for the wounded as they rolled on their litters while the ships plunged and heeled in the gale-driven seas. Wounds reopened, and men bled to death. Aboard the Tonnant, 16 men had survived amputations. 14 of them died during the storm. The battered and holed Redoubtable, still under tow by the Swiftsure, gradually settled into the water. The Swiftssure's crew saved as many wounded as they could, risking their own lives in small boats in the raging seas. Many of the 474 left aboard were still alive when, on the day after the battle, the Redoubtable went down. The Santissima Trinidad, once the pride of Spain, was now dismasted and a giant rolling shell. She refused to sink for almost 3 days, while crewmen from the British Ajax and Revenge tossed her dead overboard and lowered what wounded they could into the lurching boats. The big four-decker had carried a crew of 1,115. Fewer than half were saved. On the 24th, in still hurricane-force winds, the towing hawsers broke twice, and she had to be left to sink. A British boat was pushing away with the last seaman to be rescued, when someone heard a mewing sound. The boat returned to find a cat poking its head from the muzzle of a gun. As the Santa Sima Trinidad's great hull finally began to subside in a whirlpool of foam, one Spaniard recalled, "Up through the hatchways came a hideous shriek. It came from the wretches of the lower deck, who already felt the water rising to drown them." Some of the fleeing Spaniards, led by Admiral Gravina in the Principe de Asturias, made it safely back to Cadiz harbor. Gravina escaped death in battle only to be killed by his doctors, who delayed amputating his arm until gangrene set in and it was too late. Gravina is quoted as saying, "I die happy. I am going, I hope and trust, to join Nelson, the greatest hero that the world has perhaps ever produced." Admiral Villanueva's mastless Bucentaur washed up on the beach near the harbor entrance she had so grandly left 4 days earlier. Her British prize crew was rescued by the Spanish, who, in the custom of the day, treated them with courtesy. Other Britons who were driven ashore were surprised at the hospitality and the admiring reception they received. One Englishman driven ashore aboard a Spanish prize was rescued by Spanish peasants who gave him figs and wine. When he found he could not walk, a Spaniard brought up a bullock cart, gently lifted him into it, and patted him on the shoulder, saying, "Bono English," before taking him home to treat his leg. Napoleon's replacement for the defeated Villanueva, Admiral Rosalie, arrived at Cadiz on October 25th in time to report the loss of the battle and to oversee the rescue operation. Varying parties were sent along the coast. The 10-mile stretch of beach north of the headland of Cape Trafalgar was covered for days with wreckage and bodies tumbling in the surf and washing in and out with the tide. When at last the storm subsided, Collingwood sent a flag of truce into Cadiz with an offer to exchange his prisoners for the captured prizes and their British crews. The town's mayor, the Marquis de la Solana, not only agreed but also sent out a cask of wine and a supply of melons, grapes, figs, and pomegranates. Collingwood responded with the best the royal sovereign could offer, some cheddar cheese and a cask of porter. While the wounded were nursed and the prisoners exchanged, the British fleet's fastest schooner, the Pickle, raced for England with the news. For 9 days the Pickle beat through the gales, and at 1 a.m. on November 6th, her captain greeted William Marsden, first Secretary of the Admiralty, who was just going to bed. The news was both good and bad. They had won a great victory, but they had lost Lord Nelson. Not until December 22nd did the jury-rigged Victory reach Portsmouth. She had to be towed to Gibraltar for repairs. Aboard the flagship was the body of Lord Nelson, preserved in a cask of brandy and guarded day and night by sentry. One of the sentries nearly deserted his post, when in the middle of the third night there was an exhalation of gas from the body and the lid rose from the cask. The magnitude of the victory off Trafalgar was matched only by the spectacle of Nelson's funeral. Londoners of all ages and classes mourned him as if they realized that his strategic and tactical genius would make England secure at sea for a century. Villanueva, still a prisoner of war, was permitted to witness his conqueror's funeral. He was exchanged in early April 1806, took a boat across the Channel, and sent a message to his old friend Denis de Crès. He was in France and would now face the Emperor. He would await instructions at the Hôtel de la Patrie in Rennes. De Crès could not bring himself to mention to Napoleon the name of the man he knew the Emperor blamed for the loss of his great fleet. Alone in Rennes, Villanueva waited without a word from de Crès until April 21st. The next morning he was found stabbed to death in his locked room, along with a suicide note to his wife. Part of the note read, "How fortunate that I have no child to be loaded with the weight of my name as its awful inheritance." Napoleon's only announcement of the battle was to report that some ships had been lost in a gale following an imprudent engagement. But he held a formal ceremony in which Lucas and Infernet, the shortest and tallest French captains, were honored for their bravery, after returning home in a prisoner exchange. "Had all my officers behaved as you did," said Napoleon, to the man whose sharpshooter had killed Nelson, "the battle would have been a very different story." And then Napoleon, stealing Nelson's line, who 4 months after the Battle of Trafalgar ordered that on every French man-of-war there should be painted prominently the slogan, "France expects that each one will do his duty." Many years before the Battle of Trafalgar, Nelson had written to his father, "I got my rank by a shot killing a post-captain, and I most sincerely hope that I shall, when I go out of this world the same way. Then we all go in line of our profession, a parson praying and a captain fighting." There were other sailing fleet battles after Trafalgar, but none so remembered or revered. The day of the majestic, synchronized fleet engagement was dying. Only 7 years after Trafalgar, the Naval War of 1812 was fought almost entirely by frigate against frigate, instead of by the big ships of the line. And 17 years after Trafalgar, the Comet, a wooden paddle wheel steam warship of 80 horsepower, was commissioned by the Royal Navy. The age of fighting sail had ended. Maybe its greatest hero, Horatio Nelson, had died just in time.